Hi everybody, this is Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the January My Creative Scrapbook limited edition kit. I already used the kit to make several layouts and I had a number of papers left over that I cut into 1/2 inch strips. I'm using some Victorian velvet distress oxide and I'm inking the edges of all of these strips. For this layout, I'm also going to use the January sketch that was created by Rebecca Moore. As soon as I saw this sketch, I knew that I wanted to use it. I love the way there's a large diagonal on it, and I thought that I could make that diagonal out of some strips of pattern paper. I used my 18-inch ruler to draw 2 lines. I'm going to be using this piece of white cardstock to anchor all of my strips of paper on. Because the diagonal strips are longer than 12 inches, I had to use my scissors to hand cut it out rather than being able to use my trimmer. I love using strips of pattern paper on my scrapbooking layouts. I find that it's very important for me to draw some straight lines across whatever piece of paper I'm mounting these smaller strips on. And those lines will help to guide me in placing the strips down. Even if I'm not placing my strips directly on these lines, they help to guide me and let me know if I am putting any of the strips on crooked. I'm using a pen to draw the lines because I find that when I use a pencil and then run the ATG gun over the pencil lines, they get really messy. And even though it's really not a big deal because this whole strip is going to get covered up with the pattern paper strips, I just don't like that messy look and I prefer to use a pen. I usually forget to use the pen and use a pencil anyway, but in this case I did remember to use my pen. Now I'm finally ready to place the strips down on that larger strip of paper. Whenever I place strips down, I try to make sure that I'm spreading the different patterns and the different colors of the collection across the area that I'm adding the strips to. I don't want a lot of strips with the same pattern in the same spot. There was one pattern paper that was a gray pattern, and I thought that it was probably the most noticeable of all of the patterns that I was using, so I made sure that that pattern was evenly distributed. Once I was done adding those strips of paper to the larger piece of cardstock, I began thinking about the other elements that I would include on the page. So I want to have a punched out border along the edge. So I punched a border out of some gray paper, and then I also had some tags from the kit that I wanted to use, and I inked the edges of all of those with some hickory smoke. Now I'm creating a mixed media background for my layout. The paper I'm using is 120-pound smooth white cardstock. I coated that with some Liquitex gesso, and now I'm adding some sprays to it. Before I started adding the sprays, I used a pencil just to give me an approximate idea of where the elements were going to go on my layout, and that helps me to know where to put the sprays. Before I added the sprays to the whole background, I first sampled them on the center where I knew the sprays wouldn't show because the elements are going to cover them. And after using a few different sprays, trying them out, I decided that I would use 2 Lindy's Starburst sprays for this layout. I use Wild Honeysuckle Coral, and I also use Alpine Ice Rose. I use the packaging technique to press the color into the page, and then I use my heat tool to dry each layer of color. There was a spot on the background that I must have missed when I gessoed the background, so I went ahead and added a little bit of gesso to that spot. Then I used my heat tool to dry that spot, and then I continued adding more color to the background. Since I dried the color that was already there, this will be the second layer, and this will build on top of the first layer and make the color a little bit darker. With each layer, the color will get richer and richer. Sometimes I want a very dark background, sometimes I want a light one. In this case, I wanted the pink to be noticeable, but I didn't want it to be too dark. I made the color a little bit higher on the left-hand side on the top and a little bit lower on the right-hand side on the bottom. As with many mixed media backgrounds, I knew that a lot of this was going to get covered up, but I love those little touches of color that peek through. I rolled my paper towel over the top of the layout because even after I dried the layout, there were some spots where the color had pooled. So I wanted to pick up those spots of color. And now I'm going back in with a second color. You can see that I trialed it in the center just to make sure that I liked the color. Sometimes I will apply a color and I don't try it out first, and that can be disastrous. So whenever I have the opportunity, I try to do a little sample on a spot that I know won't be noticeable. I love to add splatters to the areas of color that I've made with the mixed media. And I also love to sprinkle some water on the background and then use a paper towel to lift up the droplets of water, and it creates a really cool effect. So on one hand, I'm making some areas a little bit darker with the splatters, and on the other hand, I'm making some of them a little bit lighter with the drops of water. And I think that those different techniques really help to add some interest to the area of color. The entire background is pink. I wanted to use just one color because the pattern papers are so busy and detailed. I didn't want to have a really busy background, but I do think that having lots of darks and lights can help make the area look a little bit more interesting. Now I'm adding some texture to the background using the stencil that we received in the kit and also some modeling paste. I'm using a palette knife and I am adding a little bit of modeling paste through the stencil, mainly to the areas where I've added the pink spray, but I also extend the modeling paste out just a little bit past that. I don't want the edge of where the modeling paste is to have straight lines. When I apply the modeling paste through the stencil, I try not to make the lines too straight, but if it does happen that the edge looks a little bit too straight for me, I'll just use my palette knife and scrape some of it away. Here's my diagonal strip of paper. I realized that I added the borders off camera, but I just took those border strips that I had punched out using one of my many border punches, and I added some ATG adhesive to the back and placed those on the edge. I also have some pink cardstock that I cut out. Those are going to be for my photos. I add some ATG adhesive to the back of my strips of paper, and then I attach that down to the layout. I made it at a little bit more of an angle than I had planned to, so you can see there's a little bit extra hanging over on the top right and the lower left, and I'll trim that excess paper off later on. So I have both of my photos mounted on some white cardstock, and then I mounted them once again on the pink cardstock that I just cut out, and now I'm using my ATG adhesive and I am attaching both of the photos down in the lower right hand corner of the page. I wanted to pop up the photo that's on the left, so I added some fun foam. You could see that I pieced together a number of scraps of foam that I had in my drawer. I added some ATG adhesive, and now I'm attaching that second photo down to the left of the first photo. I like to use ATG adhesive on the back of the foam so that if I want to reposition the photos as I go along, I can do that. And then later on, I'll add some liquid glue to the back of the foam to hold it down permanently. In the sketch, there are quite a few tags on the top of the strip of paper. I tried doing that. I just trialed it, and I didn't like the way it looked on my layout. It just made it look a little bit too busy. So I decided that I was just going to use these 3 tags. I use a Dress My Craft punch that I have in my stash, and I punched out some little rings so that I could put those around the openings at the top of each of the tags. And I punched those out of some pattern paper, and then I used my Crop-A-Dile to make some holes. The holes that I made were a little bit smaller than the inside of that ring of paper, so I punched a few times and it didn't make a circle, but that's okay because I know that that area is going to get covered up with the little rings that I just punched out. I inked the outside edge and I'll try to ink the inside edge of those little rings, and then I used some gel glue to attach them down, and I repeated this process for all 3 tags. Now I have all 3 tags ready to be attached down to the layout. I tucked them behind that large diagonal strip of paper. I had adhesive on that strip of paper, but it wasn't hard to lift it up a little bit and get those tags tucked in there. The pictures that I'm using on this layout are of my daughter Julia. She went to a prom. It wasn't her prom, but she did have on her fancy dress, and I thought that the photos went so well with these really pretty Prima papers, so I will often pull out photos from this day. I took quite a few when I have these really beautiful Prima collections. I wanted to add some photo corners to both of the photos. I love adding those to my layouts. I use an EK Success photo corner punch to punch those out. I ink the edges of all of the photo corners, and then I attach them down in all of the visible corners on those two photos. I wanted to add some bows to my tags, so I picked some bows out of my stash and I glued them down. I end up changing the blue one on the left. I just felt that it was a little bit too eye-catching and there was no other blue like that on the page. I decided that I really didn't like those pink mats and decided to switch them to gold mats. I used some gold embossing powder and put it around the edge of two pieces of paper, and then I heat embossed the embossing powder, and I thought that that made the photos stand out a little bit more and went better with the layout than the pink mats. So I attached the photos back down to the layout, and then I switched out that blue bow. I think that the light pink bow goes a little bit better on this layout. I had picked out a number of embellishments that I wanted to use on this layout, so I began to arrange them. I placed a different size and color butterfly on each of the 3 tags that I have on my layout. For the title, which is lovely, I used a chipboard piece from my stash. I got that many years ago in Michael's. I used the same embossing powder that I used to make the gold mats, and that way the title and the mats match together. The manufacturer of that embossing powder is Ranger, and the name of the embossing powder is Gold Tinsel. I used some adhesive, I attached down the title, and I also put some die cuts between the photos and the title to fill in that space. I felt that I wasn't happy with the way that the strips of paper didn't have much contrast with the background, so I decided to punch out some more border strips, and then I'm going to place those behind the gray ones that I already have on the layout. Because the strip of paper is on a diagonal, it measures more than 12 inches, so I had to piece together some of those punched out borders in order to make a strip that was a little bit longer than 12 inches. Earlier, I did the same thing with the gray pattern paper, but that's the part that I did off camera. So I made a strip that was a little bit longer than 12 inches for both the top and the bottom of that large strip. And I do think that that white border helped to make some contrast between the strips of pattern paper and the background. Then I used my scissors and I trimmed off the excess border strips. The butterflies that I'm using have a white border around them. I liked the white border because it helps the butterflies contrast with the tags, but I wanted that white border to be just a little bit smaller. So I used my fussy cutting scissors and I trimmed down the white edge of each of the butterflies. In the kit this month, there were some gorgeous chipboard pieces. I really love when we get chipboard in the kit, and these butterflies were really stunning. I used that same Ranger embossing powder and I embossed both of these large butterflies. There was a third butterfly, but I decided to save that for another layout. I thought that having all 3 would just be a little bit too much on this layout. I also wanted to include some of these beautiful flowers that we received in the kit. For this layout, I use some pink flowers in all different shades, and I have them in 3 different clusters. I'm making the biggest cluster to the left of the photos. I have a very small one near the title, and then another medium-sized one up at the top of the layout. I had some tiny white flowers on my desk that I was planning to use for another project, and I thought that these small flowers would complement the larger Prima flowers that we received in the kit, so I added just a couple of those to each of the clusters. I fussy cut out, I think, an entire piece of pattern paper that had these beautiful flower clusters, which I find frequently with these Prima collections. They have such gorgeous flowers. So I have incorporated some of those fussy cut flowers in each of the flower clusters. I think those paper flowers really help to add to the clusters with the dimensional flowers. So I use some ATG adhesive to attach the butterflies down. Once again, I use ATG adhesive because I love to move things around the layouts, and I know that they won't be attached down permanently with the ATG adhesive. I did a little bit more arranging of each of the clusters before I attach them down. I'm using some gel glue on this particular layout. Sometimes I'll use some heavy gel medium. In this case, the flowers weren't so large, so I decided to see if the gel glue would be enough. I'm so sorry my head is in this part of the video quite a bit. Please excuse that. I am adding some jewels to my layout, and I have to get really close to make sure that I am putting them exactly where I want them. I'm using a little bit of glossy accents and a tweezer to apply the jewels to the page. I put quite a few on the butterflies and on the title. I also put some on the photo corners. I finish putting the jewels on the page by putting some on the bows. I thought that a jewel on each of the bows would help to tie that area into the rest of the layout. I was happy with the way the layout was turning out, but I was thinking that there was a color missing. I looked very carefully at the pattern papers, and I noticed that there were hints of a dark green. I thought that it would be a good idea to introduce that color into the layout. I just thought it would add a little something to it. I had a number of die cuts from other layouts that I had handy, and I used some paint that I had in my stash, and I painted them a dark green to go along with the green color that was in the pattern papers. And then I started tucking those die cuts into the flower clusters, and I think that this really helped to complete the color scheme of this page. And the branches helped to fill out the clusters. I wanted to add a few more little finishing touches. So after I had attached all of those branches down, I added some glitter to all of the flowers by using some Opal glitter medium. I bought this quite a while back at Hobby Lobby when they were having one of their clearance sales. I like that it's clear and it just adds a little bit of glitter and sparkle. This glitter medium dries pretty quickly, which is something else that I really like about it. After I had applied the medium to each of the flowers, I decided that I wanted to add some highlights too. I'm using some Finnabair heavy white gesso. I'm using an old bristle brush, and I'm dabbing the gesso on the edges of the petals and in some cases on the centers of the flowers too. I think that this just adds a nice little finishing touch to the flowers and makes them look a little bit more dimensional. After I had finished adding the gesso to the flowers, I decided that I needed one more flower in the cluster right underneath the photo, and that is the very last touch. This layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Take a look in the description box and you will find the link to the My Creative Scrapbook website where you could check out all of the beautiful kits. Each month they come out with a gorgeous new selection of kits. I hope you have a fantastic day and I hope I'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.